The morning fog clung to the cliffs of Omaha Beach like a burial shroud. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann crouched inside Widerstandsnest 62, a concrete bunker overlooking the killing zone below, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the bitter cold that had settled into his bones during the night watch. Through the narrow observation slit, he watched the gray waves churn against the shore, carrying with them the first wave of American landing craft. The smell of cordite already hung in the air, mixed with salt and seaweed. Beside him, his squad leader, Feldwebel Ernst Vogel, lit a cigarette with steady hands and laughed, a sound that seemed impossibly casual given what was unfolding below. "Look at them," Vogel said, exhaling smoke through his nostrils. "Stumbling like children. And those rifles, have you seen them? Toys, American toys for American boys playing at war." Hartmann had seen them. Through his binoculars, he'd watched the first Americans wade through chest-deep water, clutching their M1 Garand rifles above their heads. The weapons looked small from this distance, almost delicate compared to the robust Mauser Car 9.8K that rested against the bunker wall beside him. The German soldiers had been briefed on American equipment during training sessions that felt like a lifetime ago. Their instructors had shown them photographs, technical diagrams. The M1 Garand, 8-round internal magazine, semi-automatic, fire, .300 6 Springfield cartridge. On paper, it was respectable. In the hands of what German propaganda had portrayed as soft, undisciplined conscripts from a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, it seemed almost laughable. The MG 42, machine gun mounted at the bunker's firing port, began its terrible song, a sound like fabric tearing, but amplified 1,000 times. 1,200 rounds per minute. Hitler's buzzsaw, the Americans would come to call it. Vogel moved to the gun, his hands expertly feeding the ammunition belt. And for the first few minutes of that gray morning, everything proceeded exactly as the German defenders had expected. The confidence that settled over the German positions that morning was not born of arrogance alone, but of experience hardened through 5 years of continental warfare. These were men who had fought in Poland, France, the Low Countries, and the frozen wastes of Russia. They had faced British Enfields and Soviet Mosin Nagants. They had weathered artillery barrages and aerial bombardments. The Atlantic Wall, that great chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, represented the culmination of German defensive doctrine concrete. Steel, overlapping fields of fire, and the certain knowledge that any assault against prepared positions would break like waves against rock. The M1 Garand rifle, introduced to American forces in 1936, represented something the German military establishment struggled to comprehend: the democratization of firepower. While European armies still largely relied on bolt-action rifles that required manual cycling after each shot, the United States had equipped its entire infantry with a semi-automatic weapon that fired as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. General George Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But in the early morning hours of June 6th, as German defenders looked down the breaches, such assessments seemed the product of American hyperbole. Technical specifications told one story. The M1 weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded, measured 43.6 inches in length, and could fire accurately to 500 yards, with a maximum effective range beyond 800. Its end-block clip system meant that a trained rifleman could fire 8 rounds, eject the clip with that distinctive metallic ping, and reload in under 5 seconds. Compared to the Car 9.8K, which required a soldier to manually work the bolt between each of its 5 rounds, the difference in sustained fire rate was substantial, perhaps. 30 aim shots per minute versus 12. The numbers on technical manuals meant little to men like Vogel and Hartmann, who had learned warfare's lessons in the crucible of actual combat. They had seen countless weapons perform beautifully on proving grounds only to fail when caked with mud, or frozen in winter cold, or subjected to the chaos of extended engagements. The true test of any weapon system was not how it functioned in ideal conditions, but how it, and more importantly, The men wielding it performed when everything went to hell. What Klaus Hartmann expected that morning was a repeat of Dieppe. In August 1942, he had been stationed near that French port when predominantly Canadian forces attempted an amphibious assault. The operation had been a catastrophe. Of the 6,000 men who landed, fewer than half returned to England, and the beaches had been littered with abandoned equipment and the dead. The lesson seemed clear. Fortified positions commanded by experienced troops would always triumph over even numerically superior attackers. Trying to establish a beachhead, what Hartmann experienced instead began as confirmation of this doctrine, then slowly transformed into something that defied his understanding of how battles were supposed to unfold. The first wave of Americans who reached the beach at Omaha died in large numbers, this much aligned with expectation. The MG-42 positions carved through them with mechanical efficiency. Bodies accumulated at the waterline, at the seawall, in the shallow craters pocking the sand. From inside the bunker, through the acrid smoke of continuous fire, the defenders could see men falling, equipment burning, the surf turning pink with blood. Vogel's laugh had been replaced by grim satisfaction. Just like Dieppe, he muttered. Just like always. But the Americans kept coming. This was the first deviation from script. At Dieppe, after the initial slaughter, the assault had faltered, then broken, then collapsed into retreat. Here, despite casualties that should have shattered unit cohesion, despite the murderous fire from positions that should have been impregnable, the Americans continued to advance. Small groups would huddle behind obstacles, then rush forward. They would fall, and others would take their place. The M1 Garand rifles began to bark not the slow, methodical pace of bolt-action fire, but a rapid, sustained rhythm that started to answer the German machine guns. "They're not stopping," Hartmann said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Why aren't they stopping?" Vogel didn't answer. His attention had shifted to a new problem. The Americans were beginning to concentrate their fire on the bunker apertures. Not wild, panic shooting, but aimed, deliberate fire. Bullets began to ricochet inside the firing ports with increasing frequency. One caught a young private named Steiner in the throat. He died clutching the ammunition belt, his blood mixing with the gun oil. The casualty should have been acceptable, even expected, but it marked the beginning of something Vogel couldn't quite articulate. The Americans were learning, adapting, executing fire and movement tactics that should have required weeks of training, but were being improvised on a beach-turned killing ground. The documented accounts of what happened on Omaha Beach that day contain a contradiction that German defenders struggled to reconcile. Official U.S. Army reports indicate that by 0830 hours, barely 2 hours after the first landings, the assault appeared on the verge of failure. General Omar Bradley, commanding from the USS Augusta offshore, seriously considered evacuating Beach. Yet by noon, American forces had achieved penetrations of the coastal defenses. By nightfall, they held a lodgment 6 miles wide and in places nearly 2 miles deep. What changed was not the weapon system. Both sides continued to fight with the same equipment throughout the day. What changed was the cumulative effect of sustained, accurate rifle fire delivered by men who refused to accept defeat. Sergeant John Robert Slaughter, 29th Infantry Division, would later describe the experience. "We were pinned down, that's true, but we had these rifles that could put out fire faster than anything the Germans had at the individual soldier level. When you have 10, 15 guys all firing Garands at a bunker slit, you could keep their heads down long enough for somebody to move. That's all we needed, just enough suppression to move." The M1 Garand's semi-automatic capability meant that American riflemen could deliver sustained suppressive fire without the pauses required to manually cycle a bolt. A squad of 8 men with Garands could theoretically put 64 rounds. Downrange in the time, it took a comparable German squad with Kar 98Ks to fire perhaps 25. More critically, they could maintain this rate of fire while advancing, keeping enemy positions suppressed during the most vulnerable moments of an assault. Inside wider stanza 62. Klaus Hartmann began to understand this calculus through direct experience. Every time he or his comrades attempted to lean into their firing positions to engage the advancing Americans, a storm of .3006 rounds would force them back. The bullets didn't have to hit, though increasingly they did. They simply had to. Arrive with such frequency that remaining exposed meant certain death. The concrete bunker that had seemed an impregnable fortress began to feel like a trap. "We need to fall back," Hartmann said during a brief lull when the Americans were reorganizing. His ears rang from the continuous gunfire. The bunker stank of cordite, blood, and the acrid smell of overheating metal. Vogel shook his head. "To where?" "This is the position. We hold the position." But holding was becoming synonymous with dying. The MG-42, that terrible weapon that had massacred the first waves, was beginning to fail not mechanically, but tactically. Its rate of fire, so devastating against troops in the open, consumed ammunition at a rate the supply chain couldn't sustain under these conditions. Worse, its fixed position made it a target that the Americans, once they'd identified it, could systematically suppress. The bunker's narrow firing ports, designed to protect the defenders, now limited their ability to respond to threats approaching from multiple angles. By mid-afternoon, the character of the battle had fundamentally shifted. What began as a defensive victory was transforming into a desperate holding action. The Americans had gotten off the beach. They were in the bluffs. They were moving through the villages that overlooked the landing zones. And everywhere they went, that distinctive 8-round clip pinged as it ejected, followed immediately by the sound of another being loaded. Obergefreiter Werner Pluskat, manning an observation post with a direct telephone line to the German headquarters, made increasingly frantic reports throughout the day. "They keep coming," he repeated in various forms. "We kill them, and they keep coming. They have unlimited ammunition. They have unlimited men. We cannot stop them all." This was the psychological transformation that no amount of tactical briefings had prepared the German defenders for. They had expected to face an enemy that, when bloodied, would retreat. They had expected that superior defensive positions would create an arithmetic of casualties that made continued assault untenable. What they encountered instead was an enemy that seemed to have internalized a different calculus entirely, one where casualties, while tragic, were an acceptable cost of inevitable victory. The M1 Garand became the physical manifestation of this ideology. Each individual rifle was not dramatically superior to its German counterpart. A well-trained soldier with a Kar 98K could, under certain conditions, be just as lethal as one with a Garand. But the Garand represented something larger than its technical specifications. It represented an American industrial capacity that could equip every rifleman with a semi-automatic weapon, that could produce ammunition in quantities that seemed limitless, that could land tens of thousands of men on a hostile shore, with the certain knowledge that behind them stood millions. More, and behind them stood factories running 3 shifts, and behind them stood a continent that had never known invasion. Klaus Hartmann fired his last magazine sometime around 1,600 hours. By then, Vogel was dead, killed by a rifle shot that came through the bunker's rear entrance when American infantry had worked their way around the position. Steiner was long dead. Of the original 12-man bunker crew, only 4 remained. They had no ammunition for the MG-42. They had perhaps 20 rounds total for their personal weapons. Outside, they could hear American voices, American boots on concrete, American equipment clanking. "We surrender," asked Private Muller, barely 19 years old, his face streaked with tears and powder residue. Hartmann looked at the rifle, and his hands, a fine weapon, well made, served him faithfully. He thought about all the briefings that had dismissed the Americans as inferior soldiers with inferior equipment. He thought about Vogel's laugh that morning, which now seemed to have occurred in a different lifetime. He thought about the sound that had become the soundtrack to this day's transformation, that rapid, sustained bark of the M1 Garand. a sound that meant someone was putting 8 rounds downrange while you were still working your bolt. Yes, he said quietly, we surrender. The statistical record of D-Day provides the skeletal framework of what occurred, but numbers alone cannot capture the psychological shift that June 6th represented in the German understanding of their enemy. American forces suffered approximately 2,400 casualties at Omaha Beach, figure that represented roughly 20% of the landing force. By conventional military doctrine, such losses should have resulted in mission failure. Instead, they resulted in a successful lodgment that would, within weeks, expand to encompass the entire Normandy Peninsula. German casualties for the day are less precisely documented, but estimates suggest roughly 1,000 killed, wounded, or captured in the Omaha sector alone. More significantly, the psychological casualties, the shattering of certain assumptions about American martial capability, would reverberate through the remaining 11 months of the European War, in the days following. The invasion, captured German soldiers were interrogated about their experiences. Their reports, now preserved in military archives, contain recurring themes. Many mentioned being surprised by the aggressiveness of American infantry tactics. Almost all mentioned the volume and accuracy of American rifle fire. One report quotes, "An unnamed unteroffizier. We were told they could not shoot. And we were told they would panic under fire. We were told their equipment was inferior. All of these things were lies. Their rifles fired faster than ours. They had more ammunition than we did. And they did not stop coming." The M1 Garand, that weapon, German propagandists had mocked as evidence of American industrial excess over martial efficiency, had proven to be something unexpected. The perfect weapon for an army built on different principles than European military tradition, where German doctrine emphasized the supremacy of the machine gun and the defensive power of prepared positions. American doctrine was beginning to evolve toward a more aggressive, mobile infantry, armed with weapons that allowed them to generate their own suppressive fire without relying solely on crew-served weapons. Technical evaluations, conducted by German ordnance experts who examined captured Garands, confirmed what the frontline soldiers had experienced. One report from July 1944 concluded, "The American M1 rifle represents a different philosophy of infantry combat. While our Car 9 AK is superior in some respects, it is more robust, more accurate at extreme range, and simpler to maintain. M1's semi-automatic capability provides the American soldier with a significant tactical advantage in offensive operations. A squad armed with these weapons can generate sustained suppressive fire while advancing, something that is extremely difficult with bolt-action rifles. We must acknowledge that in the specific conditions of the invasion, where aggressive offensive action was required against prepared defensive positions, the American weapon system proved more suitable to the task." In the weeks and months that followed D-Day, as the Allied advance ground through the hedgerows of Normandy, across France, into Belgium, and finally into Germany itself, the M1 Garand became more than just a rifle. It became a symbol both to the Americans who carried it and to the Germans who faced it. For American soldiers, the Garand represented a tangible advantage, a piece of equipment that, while not perfect, gave them confidence that their nation's industrial might was backing them with the best available tools. The rifle's reliability became legendary. It functioned in the mud of Normandy, the cold of the Ardennes, and the dust of the German interior. Its ping when the clip ejected became so iconic that debates still continue about whether German soldiers learned to listen for this sound as an indicator that an American rifleman was momentarily vulnerable during reload. Regardless of the tactical reality of this claim, the fact that such debates exist speaks to the weapon's psychological presence on the battlefield. For German soldiers, the Garand came to represent the futility of their situation. Every tactical advantage they had relied upon superior training, combat experience, defensive positions, crew-served weapons, proved insufficient against an enemy that could match them in skill. exceed them in material, and most devastatingly, sustain losses. That would cripple a German unit while continuing to advance. The rifle, firing its rapid semi-automatic cadence, became the auditory signature of this inexorable advance that Klaus Hartmann survived the war. He spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in England, working on farms, learning broken English from the guards and the BBC radio programs they were allowed to hear. When he returned to Germany in 1947, he found his hometown in the British occupation zone, half destroyed by bombing, struggling to rebuild. He worked construction, married, raised children, rarely spoke about the war. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a French documentary crew tracked him down. He was 63 years old, a grandfather working part-time as a groundskeeper for a local school. They asked him what he remembered most vividly about. That day, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the sound, that clicking sound of their rifles reloading, ping, ping, ping. It was constant. We had been told they would break. We had been told we could hold the beaches. But that sound, it never stopped. It just kept coming closer and closer. We could kill them, but we could not stop the sound. I knew then, even before we surrendered, even before the bunker was overrun, I knew we had been lied to. Not about the rifles being toys, about everything. The M1 Garand remained in American military service until 1957, when it was gradually replaced by the M14. Over 5.4 million were produced between 1936 and 1957. Many were given to allied nations through military aid programs. Some are still in ceremonial use. You can still hear that distinctive ping at military funeral services when honor guards fire their salutes. But the true legacy of the weapon extends beyond its technical specifications or its service life. The M1 Garand represented a moment when American industrial philosophy, mass production of sophisticated technology made available to individual soldiers, proved decisive against the military doctrine that had dominated European warfare for generations. It was not the only factor, an Allied victory, nor even the most important. But it was symbolic of a larger truth that the German military establishment struggled to accept until defeat made denial impossible. In the archives of the German Military Museum in Dresden, there is a display case containing a single M1 Garand, captured on Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The placard beneath it is simple: the rifle the Americans brought to our shores. We mocked its size. We questioned its effectiveness. We learned otherwise. On summer mornings, when fog rolls in from the English Channel and settles over the beaches of Normandy, you can stand at the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer and look out over the cliffs where Widerstandsness 62 once commanded the waterline. The bunker remains a gray concrete scar on the landscape, its firing ports now silent, filled with 60 years of silence. The beach below is peaceful, empty except for tourists and morning joggers. The surf washing clean sand. But if you close your eyes and really listen, you can almost hear it still. That rapid, distinctive bark of 8 rounds fired in quick succession, the metallic ping of an empty clip ejecting, the click of a fresh clip being loaded, the sound of boys from Kansas and Texas and New York standing in chest-deep water under murderous fire, refusing to retreat, the sound of an ideology that believes citizen soldiers, properly equipped and committed to a cause larger than themselves, could overcome any fortification, any defensive doctrine, any amount of scorn from those who believed warfare was the province of professional militaries and ancient bloodlines, the sound of democracy, industrial and imperfect and unstoppable, arriving on European shores with a rifle that was, despite all the mockery, exactly the right size for the task at hand. Ping.